Do you remember when cartoons were supposed to be safe, silly, and full of cheerful mascots? Think again. The 1980s unleashed a wave of animated shows that dove headfirst into nightmare fuel, leaving parents bewildered and kids glued to the screen for all the wrong reasons. But why did these creators think kids could handle stories filled with shadows, fear, and loss? Are these the shows that secretly shaped our darker side? Stick around, because some of these cartoons pushed way past the comfort zone, and the most haunting example might be one you least expect. Spiral Zone, 1987. Some 80s cartoons flirted with darkness, but Spiral Zone dove right into the deep end. This was a show where evil literally took over half the world and left everyone else scrambling for survival. The premise is bold. The villain, Dr. James Bent, better known as Overlord, unleashes a wave of zone generators across the globe, turning entire cities into zombie-like shells. Ordinary people wander in circles with glazed eyes, controlled by evil, while the remains of humanity cling to hope with futuristic tech and battered resolve. What makes Spiral Zone so unique isn't just the creepy visuals or moody music, it's the sense that nobody is really safe. The heroes, called the Zone Riders, are a last stand against a world gone hopelessly wrong. Episodes are packed with tension and loss. There's no reset button, characters and cities stay damaged, and the psychological toll is heavy. The villains aren't just monsters, they're fallen soldiers and victims of the zone too. Even the technology is tinged with despair, often failing at the worst moments. The show's art style is loaded with shadows and fog, creating a feeling of unease that doesn't let up. For kids expecting heroic triumph, Spiral Zone delivers a hard lesson about perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a forgotten classic that pushed the edge of what American animation dared to show kids, and it's a prime example of the 80s at its darkest. The Transformers. If you were a child of the 80s, nothing could prepare you for the emotional wrecking ball that was The Transformers, the movie. The TV series already had its moments of danger, but the movie dialed the darkness up to 11. Picture this. Kids packed into theaters, popcorn in hand, ready for another robot adventure. Within minutes, they're blindsided by a full-on massacre. Fan favorites, heroes who had been saving the day for years, were wiped out with cold efficiency. The death of Optimus Prime wasn't just a plot twist, it was a cultural trauma. Kids cried in theaters. Some reportedly had to be taken out by their parents. And the darkness didn't stop there. The movie's villain, Unicron, is a literal planet-eating monster, devouring worlds in terrifying, apocalyptic scenes. The battles are fierce, the stakes are life and death, and there's a real sense that nobody is safe. Even the TV series, in its later seasons, tackled themes of loss, betrayal, and the fallout of war. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a crash course in grief. The fallout was so intense that producers scrambled to soften later stories and bring back lost characters. But looking back, that raw edge is exactly why the Transformers became such a lasting phenomenon. It treated its audience with unexpected seriousness. It forced young fans to reckon with change, sacrifice, and the pain of saying goodbye. No other cartoon about toy robots dared to hit that hard, and for many, that unforgettable jolt is what made it legendary. Inhumanoids, 1986. What happens when your Saturday morning cartoon looks and feels more like a horror movie? Welcome to the world of Inhumanoids, a show that gave kids a first-class ticket to Nightmare City. Imagine a team of armored scientists battling gigantic, grotesque monsters who crawl out of the earth and wreak havoc in ways you wouldn't expect to see outside a scary late-night film. Inhumanoids didn't just hint at danger, it showed it, full throttle. Mutated flesh, melting bodies, and creatures with skeleton faces. This was not your typical toy commercial in disguise. The main villains, Metlar, Tendril, and Decompose, were the stuff of pure nightmare fuel. One literally turns people into zombies with a touch. The heroes, called the Earth Corps, were constantly outmatched, and the tone was grim. The show embraced a color palette that felt more at home in a haunted house, and the soundtrack was enough to make you look over your shoulder even in daylight. Storylines were loaded with betrayal, desperation, and plenty of moments where hope seemed lost. For young viewers used to simple good versus evil, Inhumanoids felt like a jump scare that just wouldn't quit. 1986, 1989. What's wild is that Inhumanoids was intended to sell action figures, but it felt more like it was daring you not to turn away. It's no wonder parents complained and censors took notice. Even today, the show has a loyal cult following who remember it as the series that didn't pull its punches. If you wanted your cartoons with a heavy side of fear and a dash of the bizarre, Inhumanoids was the only game in town, and nothing else on TV was quite as dark. Galaxy Rangers 1989. Blending sci-fi and westerns, Galaxy Rangers brought something completely different to the cartoon table, a show that refused to talk down to its viewers. On the surface, it's all lasers, space horses, and robots, but dig a little deeper and you'll find some of the most mature stories ever to air in kids' animation. The villains weren't just bad guys, they were sinister, cunning, and driven by motives more complex than take over the world. Episodes tackled mind control, loss, sacrifice, and corporate greed with a gravity that stuck with you long after the credits rolled. The animation itself was ahead of its time, but what really made Galaxy Rangers stand out was the tone. Characters suffered real consequences for their choices. Sometimes the heroes lost, and sometimes they didn't even get closure. There's an emotional honesty in the way the series handled fear, trauma, and change. Even the music felt darker and more urgent, amplifying every tense showdown and dramatic twist. The creators clearly weren't afraid to put their characters, and their audience, through the emotional ringer. For many fans, Galaxy Rangers was a first brush with grown-up themes, and that's exactly what makes it memorable. This wasn't just a show about stopping the bad guys, it was about facing tough choices and living with the fallout. It's no wonder it's often overlooked in lists of classic 80s animation. After all, how many cartoons were bold enough to ask kids to think about loss, morality, and personal responsibility? Galaxy Rangers dared to go there, and for those who tuned in, it made an impact that never quite faded. The Real Ghostbusters, 1986. If you thought catching Ghost was all laughs and light shows, The Real Ghostbusters had other plans. Sure, this cartoon brought plenty of comedy and slapstick, but every so often it slammed the brakes and dove straight into the deep end of fear. Some episodes are legendary for how dark they went. Hauntings that turned existential, monsters that were more disturbing than funny, and plot lines that left you looking under your bed long after the screen went dark. Episodes like The Boogeyman Cometh and The Collect Call of Cthulhu still give people chills today. The show wasn't afraid to introduce apocalyptic threats, ancient curses, or creatures ripped right from nightmares. Even the way the ghosts were drawn could be unsettling, distorted faces, wild eyes, and movements that felt more like something out of a horror flick. The city of New York wasn't always saved in the nick of time. Sometimes the Ghostbusters lost. Sometimes the world came way too close to ending. It wasn't just the monsters that made things dark. The writers played with big ideas, fear, the unknown, even the limits of sanity. They let their heroes get scared, rattled, or even overwhelmed. That honesty made it all the more real for the kids watching, even if it sent a chill down their spine. Looking back, The Real Ghostbusters might have been one of the first shows that told kids, yes, the world can be scary, but that's exactly why heroes matter. If you grew up with this cartoon, chances are you remember the laughs, but you also remember the nightmares. Visionaries. At first glance, Visionaries. Knights of the Magical Light looks like just another cartoon built to sell toys, all shiny armor and magical powers. But dig into a single episode, and you'll find a world that's much darker than it first appears. This show took place in a ruined, post-apocalyptic future where technology has failed and magic has returned, but not as a force for good. The characters, both heroes and villains, are battered survivors fighting for scraps in a land that's as bleak as it is dangerous. Visionaries stood out for its willingness to blur the line between right and wrong. The antagonists weren't always one-note evil, and even the heroes had to make tough, sometimes questionable choices. Betrayal, desperation, and even despair played out in episodes where the consequences were real and often painful. There were episodes where the good guys lost their powers, got captured, or watched their world crumble even further. The tone was heavy, the stakes felt real, and the magic, instead of feeling whimsical, often seemed like another tool for survival in a harsh world. The animation used deep shadows and muted colors, setting the mood for a series that didn't believe in easy answers. If you tuned in expecting simple, cheerful adventures, Visionaries quickly let you know you were in for something more intense. The series didn't last long, but for those who watched, it left an impression, a reminder that sometimes even the most magical worlds are shaped by struggle and uncertainty. Dungeons & Dragons 1983-1985. You might expect a show named after a legendary role-playing game to be all fun and fantasy, but Dungeons & Dragons pulled the rug out from under young viewers almost immediately. Instead of light-hearted escapism, the series trapped a group of ordinary kids in a relentless, perilous world where every choice could mean life or death. Their only goal was to find a way home, but at every turn they were hunted, tricked, or tormented by monsters, villains, and even the world itself. What made Dungeons & Dragons truly dark was the psychological toll. The kids faced their deepest fears, sometimes turning on each other, and rarely got a break from the sense of danger that followed them. The show's main villain, Venger, wasn't just a mustache-twirling bad guy, he was a real threat who could and did ruin lives. No matter how close the heroes came to escaping, something always went wrong. The show famously never gave them a proper ending or an escape from their nightmare world. There were episodes that dove deep into despair, guilt, and tough moral choices. The emotional stakes felt sky-high. For viewers, it was both thrilling and unsettling to see a cartoon take its characters and its audience so seriously. Dungeons & Dragons showed that fantasy could be just as scary as reality, and it did so with a style and intensity that's never really been matched since. Ask any fan, and they'll tell you, this cartoon was not for the faint of heart. Thundar the Barbarian, 1980-1982. Imagine a world where the moon is split in half, cities lie in ruins, and chaos rules the earth. That's the setting for Thundar the Barbarian, a cartoon that ditched the typical happy-go-lucky vibe of the era and instead threw kids into a grim, post-apocalyptic adventure. Thundar's world is littered with mutated monsters, mad sorcerers, and threats lurking around every corner. Forget safe storylines. Here, civilization has collapsed, and only the strong, brave, or downright lucky survive. The main trio, Thundar, Princess Ariel, and Ukla the Mock, aren't just fighting baddies. They're struggling to bring even a sliver of hope to a broken world. In every episode, the landscapes are filled with reminders of humanity's downfall. Shattered skyscrapers, abandoned technology, and entire populations living in fear. The villains, often wielding dark magic or twisted science, feel far more menacing than anything you'd see in most children's cartoons. Even the weather and environment seems set on crushing anyone who tries to make things better. The animation style, loaded with shadows and harsh lines, only deepened the sense of danger and despair. There's little sugarcoating here. Even the victories often come at a price, with Thundar and friends barely escaping each episode's grim threat. For a generation of kids, this was their first taste of a world that didn't always play fair, a world where hope is hard-earned and happy endings aren't guaranteed. Thundar the Barbarian proved that sometimes even a cartoon can stare straight into the darkness and come out swinging. So, the next time someone tells you the 80s were all about bright colors and bubblegum pop, hit pause and remind them of these shows. These cartoons didn't just push boundaries, they jumped over them, leaving a trail of startled parents and sleepless kids in their wake. Which of these dark gems did you watch? And which one still gives you chills? Drop your stories in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more lists that dive deep into the wild side of nostalgia. After all, some shadows from the past are just too interesting to leave in the dark.